Welcome, everyone. We're just going to wait for a few moments while we let everyone join us today. Sort of like the old school waiting line, right? Not everybody can join all at the same time. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Megan Middleton, and I'll be introducing the event tonight. Andrea, if you would change the slide, we have something new, some technology for everyone to try here. So for the 37 people who have joined us, here is a way that Andrea will be polling for the rest of the talk tonight. So if you wanted to text a Brookfield 215 to the number 37607, then you could tell her where you're from. So I would do this for you, except I didn't bring my cell phone, so that's a shame. So feel free to text Andrea where you're from. Will start to show up. For those of you who also don't know where your cell phone is, we're probably a minority here, but we do have a chat function. So I would love to see either on the by the text message polling or in the chat where you're from or what year you graduated. Just be sure that when you're in the chat, you change it to panelists and attendees so that everybody can see it. Okay, there's 41 of you. I know one of you doesn't want to leave me hanging here. Thank you, Chuck. Oh, Chuck, I haven't seen you in years. I hope you're doing well. I appreciate you bailing me out of just having to talk to the ether. Jean, thank you. Here we go. Thanks, everyone. Medicine Hat, Alberta. I hope you all have better weather than we do right now. Oh, I suspect that that note is for Andrea from Bradford. Oh, someone from Colorado, PhD student in the 90s. Oh, hi, Tiffany. Thanks a lot for joining in. Okay, now someone wants to be brave, I know, and try texting, because otherwise Andrea's going to get to this part in her talk later, and then no one's going to join in, and it'll be subpar for her, possibly borderline embarrassing. So I think someone should get used to text messaging. Oh, we got people here from Bancroft, Golden, Colorado, Waterloo, Winnipeg. Yes, we have two brave souls who learned how to text. I appreciate this. Oh, Waterloo's getting bigger, which leads me to believe there's more people from Waterloo. See that, folks? Oh, cool. Look at this. Andrea told me this would be neat when it worked. Okay, we'll give everyone just one more minute. So again, for those just joining us, feel free to use the chat. Let us know what year you graduated. Let us know where you're from, where you're calling from tonight. Again, if you're in the chat, make sure you change the message to panelists all so that everyone can see, unless you're trying to send something private. And again, Andrea will be using this text message polling throughout her talk. So feel free to set that up on your phone now. Let us know where you're calling in from, what year you graduated, or anything else fun that you want to show up on the screen. Awesome, awesome. Thanks, everyone. Okay, well, I know that you did not all come to hear me. So welcome, everyone. Just one more time for anyone that might have missed it or who hasn't met me. I'm Megan Middleton. I work in the alumni office for the Faculty of Science, and I'm super excited to get to introduce everyone to our speakers tonight. So I just get to do a few sort of housekeeping things, and in the good old days, you know, I would have told you where the bathroom was and how you ask a question later on, but these days, because we're all on Zoom, I want to let you all know that we are in fact recording. So you'll receive an email next week with a link to where the video is being housed on YouTube. So you can send it to your friends, you can rewatch it in case you missed anything. And on that note, your video and your audio is off. So don't worry, you can't accidentally video bomb or, you know, end up feeding your cat and we can all hear you. So you're totally safe that way. I would recommend for those of you new to Zoom, you can change the view. So up in the top right corner, you'll see view. I recommend changing it to side-by-side speaker. That will remove some of these little black boxes that you see here for those of us who aren't speaking. So again, use the chat. We encourage you to leave comments for Andrea. She'll be able to read it later. Talk to each other, anything you'd like to do that way. If you do have a question though, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. And Dave and Andrea will be handling questions at the end of the talk. And that is all from me. So I want you just to have a great time, engage, and I'd now like to introduce Dave Rudolph, who's the chair of Earth and Environmental Sciences. Dave, it's all you.
Okay. Okay, Megan, thank you so much for getting us going tonight. And really interesting to see all the places that people are calling in from, and we're really glad to have that. But let me start tonight by first stating the University of Waterloo acknowledges that much of our work takes place in the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples, and our main campus is situated in the Haldeman Tract. It's a land promised to the Six Nations that includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. And our active work towards reconciliation takes place across our campus through research, learning, teaching, and community building. And it's centralized within our Indigenous Initiatives Office. So let me join Megan in welcoming everybody tonight. Thank you so much for taking the time to get on the screen again with us tonight and to attend our Faculty of Sciences new faculty lecture series. It's really been an exciting time to be able to introduce many of our new faculty members to folks. So as Megan said, I'm the chair of Department of Earth Environmental Sciences, and I'm very delighted to say that this is the new home for our speaker that you'll meet tonight. And in looking at that list of attendees that came in, I saw so many friends and colleagues and alumni from the department over the years. And wherever you are tonight, of course, we all hope and wish that you're staying well and healthy as we struggle through hopefully the last part of this really difficult time. And we can only wish we were able to hold this event, obviously, in person so we could get caught up, but that day will come soon. So as I mentioned, this is in fact the 4th offering of the lecture series, and we're really looking forward to tonight's talk, of course. But I want to thank Megan, April, and the whole entire science advancement team for thinking of all this and arranging it on our behalf. It takes an awful lot of dedicated work, so we're really appreciative of that. And there are many more to come, and we'll have this opportunity to more or less introduce a whole new generation of faculty members that have joined our Faculty of Science. And sort of on a more local note, over the last 3 years or so, there's been a period of almost, we sort of look at it as unprecedented growth within the department. We've hired 8 new faculty members. And with this growth has come a real expansion of the scope of our research and training activities. And that really reflects the skills of our new faculty members. And I'm really happy to be able to introduce you tonight, one of our new superstars, and that's our speaker, Dr. Andrea Brookfield. So Andrea started as an assistant professor in the Department of Earth Environmental Sciences in January 2020, quite a time to start as an academic at a new institution. And this is just after about 10 years after she graduated from our department with her PhD. And prior to this appointment, Andrea was an assistant professor at the University of Kansas and spent 9 years as a scientist in the Kansas Geological Survey. And her primary research interests include the development and use of efficient and very effective numerical modeling tools for water resource management. Specifically, she studies the use of hydrological models in simulating water flow and contaminant transport, and she's using those for the future prediction and management of groundwater and surface water resources as a combined resource. Andrea spent, as I mentioned, 10 years in Kansas, and she tells me that most of the time, a lot of it, she spent complaining about the heat and a lot of weird bugs. I think probably chiggers were one of them. I've had witnessed that myself. And also learning how to apply her expertise in modeling to the water scarce regions of the US Great Plains. And her talk tonight will demonstrate the need to balance the different competing demands of energy production, agriculture, and urban development in a way that maintains economic, social, environmental stability. And I'll also mention that she spends all her spare time, about 15 minutes a day, long distance running, so she's a very fast runner. And she tells me that that's about the only way she can find any time to be alone. But she also plays a lot of sports with her 2 young boys, and as a result of the pandemic, hangs out in sweatpants a lot. Who doesn't? So please join me in welcoming Andrea Brookfield tonight, and I'll pass the floor on to her and see you all on the other side. Andrea.
Thank you, Dave. And hello, everyone. So thank you all for joining us this evening. As Dave indicated, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how I use my research to try to inform sustainable water management decisions. And what I do want everyone to pay attention to here is the fact that I'm saying supporting sustainable water management decisions, because despite the fact that the physical science that I study and look at, it sort of dictates where water is located, the decisions that we make as to where and how we use them is governed by so many more things. And it's really a big multidisciplinary field that's, for me, a lot of fun to work in. So starting way back, sort of almost elementary school. So why is water important? First off, we all know something that we learn pretty much from the beginning. Water is important because we need it, right? It makes up a large percentage of our bodies. We can't survive very long without water. We also need the water to grow the food that we eat, whether it's fruits and vegetables and grains and other crops, or whether that's we're growing food for different livestock for protein sources. We need water for that. We need water for transporting it. We also need water for everything else that we have that sustains our current quality of life. Everything from the actual natural resource extraction itself, whether it's mining or forestry or oil and gas development, to the processing and manufacturing, and then to the transportation of those goods. So water is really important to all the facets of our current quality of life. And on top of that, an important part of our quality of life is enjoying nature, enjoying our environment. And that requires water as well, between the vegetation and the trees and the flora and fauna and other animals. So it's pretty evident why water is important. This isn't anything new to anyone. But we also have to point out, why is water management important? Why is this something that we have to pay attention to? And first off, water is matter, it's mass, it can't be created or destroyed. So we have a finite source of water, right? It's in different states. We move it around the earth and around our environment. We sometimes contaminate it and make it so they can't really use it very well. But we do have to manage this resource, not only because we need it for all these purposes, but we have, up until recently at least, a growing population. And not only do we have a growing population, but we have a growing population that's becoming more and more developed. And as environments and as areas become more developed, they tend to have more water intensive food requirements, tend to shift towards these more intensive crops, towards livestock and different proteins. We also see an increase in our industrial demands to maintain this quality of life, to bring other areas along in the development. That involves a lot more water use, developing different infrastructure, cars, all of the things that we take for granted, all of that requires a lot of water. And so water management is important because we're trying to plan for all of this, and we're trying to do it under a climate that we're really not too sure what's going to happen in the future. We have models to try to predict this stuff, but the results tend to be pretty uncertain when it comes to, pinpointing exactly what's going to happen. In some regions, we know we're going to see increases in temperature and decreases in precipitation. Other areas, we're going to potentially see shifts in precipitation, but the amounts we're not really too sure of. And so it's really uncertain to try to figure out sort of how do we manage water when there's so many things that we don't know. So this is why it's important to develop a structure that's flexible and adaptable, and that includes all these things so that we can plan out scenarios and see how we can manage water into the future. So as Megan indicated, I'm going to have a series of polls through this because I like to have interaction. I don't like sort of hanging out on my own. And so this is going to be the first one in this. So I want you to think about what you consider to be barriers to sustainable water management. So as I indicated in my first sort of slide, these barriers aren't always sort of physical science based, right? These are ones that can be brought on by different things such as greed. So that would, to me, would be an anthropogenic impact. A lack of water management is definitely a barrier to that as well. So you can see that there's a bunch of different things. And I really wanted this to be an opportunity for people to think about just the breadth of things and disciplines that impact how we can actually have sustainable water management. So you see here, some of them are connected. We see understanding, we see ignorance, we see knowledge. All of those are sort of related to that lack of information about our water management decisions. So moving forward with the rest of this presentation, what I'm really going to do is I'm going to walk you through a story of a basin that I worked in quite extensively in Kansas. and sort of walk you through the history and the evolution of water management in the basin, and sort of end on some of the research and where that direction of those things are going. So for those of you who have not visited, welcome to the high plains of the US. We are situated right in the middle. And the basin that we're going to talk about today is called the Republican River Basin, and it's located in portions of Colorado, Nebraska, and Kansas. So the main outline of all the little subbasins in that image on the right is showing where this whole basin is. And now this basin, as I said, center of the US, big agricultural area. So if we go way back to sort of the start of water management or concepts of the water management, we're going to start way back in the 1930s. And anybody who's familiar with any type of history related to the US, specifically that sort of middle section in the High Plains, knows that the 30s was centrally the Dust Bowl era, right? So here's an image, someone attempting to grow crops during the 1930s periods of drought. And clearly this was going to be an issue, right? There's not enough water to grow the crops. There was widespread famine and devastation. And what's perhaps a little less known about this era is right smack in the middle of the 30s, in the middle of this Dust Bowl, we also had a crazy flood in this region in 1935. So this is actually an image from the Republican River Basin. So you can imagine living here during this time. You've gone from a period of drought where you've got absolutely no water and it's devastating you. And then in the middle of that decade, you get hit with a flood that is everything you've asked for, but too much of it that also devastates you. And so moving forward with that, what action, if you were someone living in this area in the Republican River Basin in the 30s, coming out of the Dust Bowl, coming out of the flood, what action would you take? Would you pick up and move elsewhere, probably continue heading west? Would you decide to grow different crops? Would you say, well, hey, maybe I'll pick something that is a little less water intensive, so I don't have to worry about times where I don't have a lot of water? Would you build reservoirs? Would you build big infrastructure or support building infrastructure that can change how the dynamics of that water distribution? Or would you just carry on as you had been and just hope it didn't happen again? So we can see here a whole variety of different options. And obviously, I think probably all of these things collectively happened. There were people who moved. There were people who probably changed up how they operated their system. There's probably people who just carried on and ignored what was going on around them. But in a widespread scale, what happened after the 1930s was we saw large-scale water management, specifically the development of reservoir systems. And so this is where the federal government across a lot of the US put up a lot of money to develop these large-scale reservoirs, because what the reservoirs allow you to do is to change the temporal distribution or the timing of that water. Rather than relying on when it comes down from the sky, you can hold back water when you have a lot and save it, and distribute it out when you need it, perhaps during those times of drought. Can it solve the problems that we saw in the 30s? Probably not, but it could probably mitigate some of the issues. Now, if you think about the basin, the Republican River Basin, it's what we term a transboundary aquifer. So what that means is it's going across different state lines. So the federal government realized that if they started handing out a lot of money to build reservoirs in these areas, they were going to have to come up with some documents to dictate how water is going to be distributed in these basins. Because you imagine the Republican River Basin, if they just handed out money to build these big reservoirs, Colorado, which is at the upstream end, was going to build the biggest reservoir they could and keep all the water to themselves. So instead, they put together these documents, and this one's called the Republican River Compact, and it's essentially an agreement between Colorado, Nebraska, and Kansas that says how much water of the virgin water supply, which causes issues because how do you consider what that is, regardless how that water is distributed between the 3 different states. Fortunately for the Republican River Compact, when they wrote this up, it was done by percentage. So a percentage of this virgin water supply, or the amount of water that would be in the basin had we not manipulated everything as humans, is distributed by certain percentages. So when we have a lot of water one year, everybody gets more than usual. And when we have a drought year, everybody gets a little bit less. You might be familiar with other water issues across the US and across the world. Colorado River Basin is an example where they had a compact where when it was written, they did not use percentages, they used volumes. And that is now causing big issues because they have a certain allocation and a volume to each of their states, to each of their regions. So they're assuming that they're getting a certain volume of water in that basin. And what we're seeing now is they're not getting that much. And so the people at the upstream end are sort of saying, well, this is our allocation, I'm taking it. And that continues downstream until the person at the very, or the group at the very downstream end kind of has to absorb all the losses. So they're seeing a lot of really big issues there as well. But the whole point of these compacts is essentially to try to get everybody to play along. And so the reservoirs started operating in the 50s. It took a while to have those developed and to get them up and running. What you can see in this little image here is just even in this relatively small basin itself, we have a whole lot of reservoirs. So in Colorado, we have the Bonnie moving into Nebraska. We have Swanson, we have Enders, we have Hugh Butler, Perry Strunk, Harlan County Lake, which is one that'll be featured in my research. In Kansas, we have Seabliss Reservoir. We also have Lovell Reservoir, and this whole basin drains into Milford Lake, which is actually a reservoir. There's no actual natural lakes in Kansas, which then feeds into the Kansas River, and that's the end of our basin. So our next polling question is, we have this compact, which is designed to make sure everybody gets along. How long do you think these states actually got along in this basin? So I will say this is kind of a fidgety question because for sure, right off the bat, there were people squabbling and complaining. But when we go through this, I am going to count the disagreements or count where they start really disagreeing as to when litigation would have started to occur between them. And so within this basin, and I guess I just gave away a little bit because I said when litigation began, so that 11% who said there's been never disagreements are now realizing that's, I wish there weren't disagreements, but there were. And so things started, and not necessarily the litigation, but what kicked off some of the issues was in the 70s and the 80s, we saw a lot of groundwater development across the US, particularly in the West. This was brought on by more accessible, more cheaper groundwater drilling operations, in addition to the fact that we had cheaper and more available high capacity pumps. So these are pumps that can, dissipate hundreds of gallons per minute, ideally used for irrigation, which is the primary reason that they use them in this basin. And so we saw a lot of development in the 70s and 80s. And why this is important to this story, and a little bit of a spoiler alert, is because our groundwater system and our surface water system are connected. All part of the hydrologic cycle, specifically the terrestrial hydrologic cycle. And so what we see is when we do something to our groundwater system, there's typically some form of repercussion or some form of adjustment to our surface system. These 4 images that come out of a seminal paper by Tom Winter that was published in 1998 show, so in A, we have an area where groundwater is coming into our stream. We call that a gaining stream. And in the remainder of them, B, C, and D, you see we have an environment where we have a losing stream. The stream is contributing water to the groundwater system. So keep in mind, we have groundwater development. We also know that groundwater is connected to the surface water system. So litigation from this actually began in the 90s, specifically in 1996. The great state of Kansas brought states of Nebraska and Colorado to court and in the Supreme Court, because that's the only place where states can sue each other. And the reason behind this was that we saw this development of groundwater pumping in this basin. And what Kansas was noticing as sort of the downstream end was that they weren't getting all of the water they should be. Even though Nebraska was saying, hey, we're releasing the water we should out of this reservoir. It's worked every other time. We're giving you, we're providing you with the surface water you're supposed to have. And Kansas came back and said, well, wait a minute. You've started all of this pumping. We know that groundwater and surface water are connected. And what we also know is that when you pump from a well, that's hydraulically connected to that stream system, your chances are you're going to reduce, as you can see in B, or even completely switch the direction of flow and pull water from that stream into the well. So there is a component of stream in the well that in the water that you're pumping out of these wells. And Kansas said, we need to count that. That needs to be part of what they call compact accounting, figuring out how much water each state has used. Now, when the compact was written back in the 1940s, we didn't really consider that surface water and groundwater were connected. And so the compact is clearly written to just say surface water, how we regulate and how we distribute surface water. So the whole point of this court case was to get them to recognize that water pumped from the ground, there can be a component of that that is from the surface water, that is from the stream, that needs to come into play. Fortunately for Kansas, the special master agreed with Kansas, and they had to begin trying to figure out how to account for this volume of water coming out of the wells. And that's sort of where modern numerical methods comes into play with water management in this basin. So all 3 states had to come together, and what you see here is the model that sort of goes, around the basin and comes up right to the Kansas state line, because as soon as water crosses into Kansas, we don't care anymore. Everybody's gotten what they've owed. So this model was developed in collaboration between all 3 states. It uses a code called ModFlow that's developed by the United States Geological Survey. And the image you're looking at here is all of the wells and the volumes that they're pumping in these super intuitive acre feet units that they have to take into account. So you see that there's a lot of pumping going on. And so they run this model every year. In this case, you see results from a particular month. And from this model, they figure out how much stream flow is being impacted or being reduced by the pumping of these wells. And they allocate it, as you see here, between Colorado's and Kansas and Nebraska. And this gets brought into the compact accounting. So this was the idea to solve it, right? So now we have a mechanism to figure out how much stream flow is in the groundwater that's being pumped. Awesome. Time to carry on. We made it, I think, 2 years after that was decided before there was more litigation. So in about 2005, Kansas once again sued the states of Nebraska and Colorado. And this was because despite the fact that they had this new agreement and this new model, they still weren't providing the water they were supposed to. Now, the problem here essentially lies in how they do water rights in a lot of the states. So a lot of these water rights are things that are allocated to people. You apply for it, you pay for them, and then that is yours. There's many properties across this area, and actually more so in Western Kansas and in Eastern Colorado, where your property itself is virtually worthless unless there's a water right attached to it. These water rights are also what they term prior appropriation. So if I get my water right before you, mine is the one that has to be sort of delivered first. So if I start running out of water, you have to shut off until I get mine. So water rights are really valuable. And they've realized that they have been pumping water, and it's water that they didn't really have to pump. And so their choices were to try to, shut down some of this pumping, but that's going to reduce your economic impact, right? You're going to reduce your GDP. And a lot of the people making these decisions are elected or appointed, and this isn't going to sit very well with their constituents. And so they kind of chose to do nothing and to see if they would get away with it. And the answer was no. Kansas noticed and sued them again. So then the decision came down. Both Colorado and Nebraska owed Kansas a lot of money just to sort of compensate for their loss of sort of GDP from their inability to grow crops to their full yield. And then turned around and did it again. And so early in the 2010s, Kansas sued once again because nothing had changed. They still weren't getting the water from all intents and purposes from their point of view. Nebraska and Colorado weren't doing anything. And so they sued again and said, okay, we need to figure something out here. There needs to be a plan. We need to see on paper how they are going to either provide the water to us or cut back on their pumping, whatever they need to actually meet the compact, because we're getting kind of sick and tired of paying all of our lawyers to do this. So the next polling question is, what do you think Colorado and Nebraska decided to do to meet their compact requirements? So the 4 choices that I'm giving you here are kind of the 4 main ones that we had heard being debated. Do you think they cut back on pumping? So they went around and started telling people they had to stop pumping as much as they were, which means reducing crop yield and probably ticking off a lot of people and maybe not letting you get your job back later. Did they decide to bring water in from other basins to meet this? And let's just say it's not like the basin next to it has a lot of water itself. A lot of the area across there, particularly if you go further west or south, has even less water than this basin does. Would they pump water into the river, but from other locations within the basin? And then the last choice was do nothing and keep paying the lawyers. Is it cheaper to keep going and having litigation than to take any of these options? So the answer, for the most part, that both states took was to pump water from within the basin into the river. And so the image on the left is from the Colorado Compact Pipeline. And this is where they had a series of groundwater wells where they pumped water out of that. And as you see in the image, constructed a series of canals with weirs so they could get their exact accounting. They could get credit for exactly how much water they're putting into the system. Nebraska did something similar as well. The image on the right is one of their 2 programs to do this. The one not shown is titled Rock Creek. And in this one here from NCOR, this one was kind of interesting because they also were pulling in groundwater from within the basin. But to get the groundwater, what they did is they went around and they purchased water rights. Anybody who was willing to retire or cut back their water right, whether they were going to switch to less intensive, water intensive crops, go to dryland farming, or just quit the area altogether, they purchase those and then can pump that volume and again, dig a very expensive canal, put in this weir system and bring the water into the river. So that was sort of the latest state of things there and how they tried to meet these compact requirements. And this was fairly recent. So the decision was 2016, and this really just started coming online a few years ago. Behind all of this, there was research going on. And this is where I kind of come into play. So in about 2010, the US Bureau of Reclamation, which operates most of the reservoirs in this basin and pretty much all of Western US, put out a request for proposals under what they call the Water Smart program. But the whole point of the money they're giving out in these cases is to try to give water users and states, et cetera, money to look into how they can get more beneficial use out of the water in their basins. How can they operate their reservoirs differently, use water in the basin differently? At this point in time, all the states were suing each other. And so Colorado put in a proposal, Nebraska put in a proposal, and Kansas put in a proposal for this basin, but separately. The Bureau came back and said, we would love to fund you, but you have to play together and you have to put together one proposal and submit that. So I was part of that work. Part of that work included a lot of lawyers and a lot of legalese about how everything that I'm going to present here is my research and it does not reflect the state of Kansas and cannot be used for any current or future litigation. So I was focusing on the area, the downstream area, what we call the lower Republican River Basin. So the area in the sort of upper left image that's kind of shaded brown and hatched. It includes a portion of Nebraska because we're going all the way up to Harlan Reservoir, which is our upstream end, and flows down to Milford Reservoir, which is sort of the end of the Republican River Basin. You see, we also have one other reservoir in the middle titled Lovewell Reservoir. And you also see these light blue lines, and those are not tributaries. Those are all irrigation canals. These are man-made canals, over 300 kilometers of them. Much like the reservoirs change the temporal distribution of water, allowing us to sort of release it when we want it, the irrigation canals allow us to change the spatial distribution. So now if you're not right by the stream, if you're near a canal, you can purchase water rights through an entity called the Kansas Bostwick Irrigation District if you're in Kansas, and you can get water routed through these. So you would call up Kansas Bostwick Irrigation District and say, in 5 days, I want this much water. They collect all the requests, call the Bureau of Reclamation. They release water from Harlan Reservoir. And then the KBID, the Bostwick Irrigation District, has people, they call them gauge runners, who go around and open all the gates to get water exactly where it needs to be. So my job in all of this was to try to develop a numerical model that can capture how water moves through this system. And this was complicated by the fact that we had our natural flow system, the image on our left, where we have trees and vegetation and how our water sort of naturally flowed through the system. And we overlaid on top of that the images on our right, reservoirs and reservoir management. These canal systems that flow is dictated by when and where people are calling water from. To simulate these, there isn't a model or wasn't a model that could capture this sort of breadth of different flow environments and flow rules and regulations. So what we did is we coupled two different models. The first one being an integrated hydrologic model, and this is one that simulates that sort of natural flow system. We coupled that with what we call a surface water operations model, which can simulate the engineered flow system, our reservoir operations, the canal systems, and the demands and the distribution of those. Now I've got a couple of slides that do have equations on them, and this is really just to show you how different these two models were, to give you an idea of the complexity in bringing them together. So the integrated hydrologic model that we used is called Hydrogeosphere. It was developed here at the University of Waterloo. I worked with it as part of my PhD. And essentially what you're looking at here is the governing equations for the top one, surface water flow, and the second one is subsurface flow. And these two are connected by those red terms, which is the exchange of water between them. So this is physically based, means we're routing water and moving water within the system based on physics, based on how we think it should move, with the characterization and how that's been governed through physics. Countering that is we have our surface water operations model, which we use a code called Oasis, developed by a company called Hydrologics. And this one uses optimized linear programming, which basically means it's trying to optimize the value of water because of constraints and goals and priorities and penalties that we've put in place. Constraint would be, for example, you can't release more water from a reservoir than the reservoir currently has in it. A goal is trying to make sure that anybody who calls water, who has allocation to it, can get that water. You can think of these weights and priorities and penalties as trying to meet, say, a senior water demand, somebody who has an older water right, over a junior one. Or trying to make sure that the water in the reservoir stays between the sediment pool, which is the bottom pool that we don't want to get into, and below the flood pool, which is sort of that buffer area that they like to keep open in case of times of flood. So at every time step, it tries to optimize this and figure out where it has the best bang for its buck with respect to water in the system. So we developed a method to couple these two together so that we can integrate that natural flow system and this engineered system. And that's great. But if there's anything you need to know about models or anything, you can build the most awesome thing in the middle, but if you don't have good data or good information going in, you're not going to have good information coming out. There is a lot of things that need to go into a model like this. For example, we need to know what's happening in the subsurface. We have to characterize it. What type of conductivity is it? How easily does the water flow through that? We also need to know what's happening on the surface. What is the topography like? Because of course that's going to dictate how water flows over the surface. What is our land cover like? Because if it's a forest versus a crop versus a grassland versus urban, how that water moves, how it infiltrates into the subsurface is going to be different. We also need data about these systems to give initial conditions and to calibrate the system. So we need some idea of what the groundwater levels were at certain periods of time to make sure the model works properly. We also need information about what the surface water levels are like. Adding on top of this, we need information about how much water is being pumped. There's over 1,000 high capacity, and here we talk to high capacity as anything over 400 gallons per minute across this basin. There's 500 surface water diversions, and there was 300 kilometers of canal system. And then on top of that, we have to put into all of the rules and regulations that govern how you operate a reservoir, how you decide who's allowed to get water, and how those rules have changed with time, because every time we as Kansas sued somebody, the rules changed. So despite all of this, we actually managed to build a model that represented the system fairly well. What you're looking at here is what we term calibration results. The image on the left is showing you how our groundwater compared. So our observed pressure head is what we found in the field, so our observed groundwater levels, and our simulated is what we simulated in our model. Ideally, we see this along that solid one-to-one line. You see that things got a heck of a lot better starting in 1996, and that's because prior to 1990, we were unable to simulate our surface water operations model because there wasn't any data there. So this sort of shows the importance of having that surface water operations information when it comes to our groundwater component of the model. The image on the right is showing you Concordia gauge station. And so this is showing us how our surface water system at this gauge station matched. So we see observed in blue and our modeled in green. We do a pretty good job. We tend to overestimate things, but overall we feel like we saw most of the patterns. The last thing we could look at was how our reservoir operations were matched. Here, things didn't quite go as planned. We see the same general pattern, of course, those annual variations, but we were missing some of those details. You see those modeled ones have a very typical trend that we don't see in the observed. And that's because the release of water from a reservoir, although we've programmed in all the rules that govern it, is still decided on by a person. And that person makes judgment calls to bend those rules fairly often. So that's something that we're still working on. So now we have this model built, and the whole point of doing this is to now test out different strategies. So what strategies do you think Kansas should try to simulate to reduce future water shortages? So the options I'm giving you here is we can increase the size of the reservoir, we can change how we operate a reservoir, we could potentially build a new one, or we can just do nothing. So these weren't all of the options that were available, but these were the main ones that Kansas decided to pursue. And so if we take a look at the results, the first thing that I'm going to show you is the results don't include building a new reservoir, because as we were simulating it, the folks were also calculating how much it would cost, and the cost of building a new reservoir had them say, nope, never mind, we don't need to do that. So taking a look at the results, what we see here is a set of results. Of course, we have no action, which means do nothing. The other ones across the bottom, the next three are increasing the reservoir capacity, and the last one is a change of reservoir operation. We took a look at this under two different climate conditions. The first one we termed baseline, which is just a repeat of the past 50 years, which is as cool and wet as we ever expect it to get. And then we countered that with a hot and dry. What we'd hoped to see is that one strategy would be the best across everything. And unfortunately, that wasn't the case. So if we expect it to stay cool and wet and to stay the same as it has been for the past 50 years, we've got to increase reservoir capacity in order to see any reduction in our water shortages. Countering that, if we expect hot and dry, there we do see reductions in water shortages if we increase our reservoir capacity, but our lowest is where we just change our reservoir operation. And increasing reservoir capacity has a huge capital cost. Changing reservoir operations just has a heck of a lot of red tape to work through. And so this was sort of good news for the state. Unfortunately, it wasn't good news in the fact that they would have to try to gamble or guess which climate conditions they were going to have moving forward. So as I was working on this, across the state and within this basin as well, I had colleagues who were working on other issues. And the issues they were working on were occurring within my basin, but being studied completely independent of my research. And they made me think, is water shortage the only thing that we should be concerned about? Are there other things that we can consider when we're looking at water management? So for example, in Kansas, we have huge sedimentation problems in our reservoirs. It reduces the capacity of the reservoirs. It changes the water quality. It can encourage algal blooms. For example, they dredged one reservoir in the state of Kansas. They have several dozen, and it cost somewhere between $20 and $30 million. Granted, the one they did pick was the one that supplies water, cooling water to the nuclear power plant, so it seemed like a wise choice. But there was a lot of money and research going into how can we prevent this. And so another step of research that I did was say, these are all connected. How water flows through the system impacts our sediment loads, impacts the nutrients getting to these reservoirs. And so the first step that I did was, let's build in something where we can estimate a fluvial erosion, so erosion of the stream bed under different management scenarios. So if we see one, if we're prioritizing water shortage and a couple of them come close, can we say, okay, they're both about the same. Does one of them have a different sediment load from the other? I have a master's student working right now who's going to augment this even further and take a look at stream bank instability, because typically stream bank slumping or failure is a huge contributor to sediment loads to these reservoirs. And this in turn will contribute towards our nutrient loading, algal blooms, etc. So this is sort of the state of things right now with respect to the Republican River Basin and the research going on there. But I want to end it with sort of a discussion about what kind of research we'll be doing here in Canada, what's relevant closer to home. And so as mentioned, I started in January 2020, not the ideal time. It was actually ideal until March to do research, and things have been progressing since then, but perhaps not as quickly as I would have liked. But the research that I'm looking at sort of mimics what I was doing in Kansas, but is paying attention to things like how much water do we have? We are a water secure and a water rich nation. We have great data collected by a host of researchers and government agencies, but I want to take a look at how much water do we actually have, paying attention to groundwater systems that are not necessarily paid closely attention to otherwise, and also take a look at how are these changing. We may have a lot now, but has it been steadily declining? Has it been going up? If it's changing, why is that changing? What is the cause of it? Is it climate induced? Is it water use induced? Is it something that we can control? And looking at all of these is contributing towards my ultimate research goal, which is figuring out how we can sustainably develop our resources. And I say this broadly, develop our water resources, but also, along with that is developing our natural resources, mineral extraction, oil and gas, forestry, all of these contribute to it. How can we sustainably develop those? And ideally, it's to say we're not at the state of the Republican River, of the Central Valley, of the Murray-Darling Valley in Australia. We're not there yet, but we also don't want to get there. So let's start planning now. So with that, thank you all for your attention, and I will take any questions that you have.
Thank you very much, Andrea. What a wonderful presentation tonight. And thanks for walking us through what might be a world-class water management problem and something that everybody can learn from. Thinking about how California probably got a lot of insight from it as well as you work through it here. And also to illustrate how advanced science can inform decisions, but decisions are often made for all kinds of other reasons that as scientists we have to incorporate into our thinking moving forward. I think that's getting more and more challenging all along. And I'm going to encourage everyone to add some questions to the Q&A. And just as we get started here, you certainly mentioned this issue of these historical water compacts. And they exist all over the world, and they were generated so long ago in a time when people had different understanding of the water resources and they had different data sets to deal with. And is it time to look at these things again and say that, really they don't fit today's conditions?
I think that is a question that some people are asking, but I think it's also something very difficult to start addressing, because these have existed for, going on almost a century in some locations, and they're deeply entrenched in how water rights were developed, how their distribution systems were developed, all of the infrastructure. And you have to remember that in some basins where some people are having problems, some people are doing just fine because of the way the compact is put together. And so I think particularly in the American West, they are revisiting these things. They are trying to make ways for these rivers to actually reach the ocean again. But what it takes is it takes, I think, a lot of collaboration and a lot of ingenuity. And I don't know that they'll start from scratch, but I know there's some efforts to modify things to hopefully not only bring water to everybody who wants it, but to ensure that we sort of maintain our ecosystems and our ecological stability.
So litigation obviously has a role to play, and it's done amazing in terms of being able to manage. It's out there. In Canada, we don't tend to move to litigation as quickly as many other countries do. So how do you see this playing out in a Canadian context? What you're showing us is maybe what we're going to see here very soon.
Yeah, I would hope not very soon. I think a lot of the work that I'm really excited about here is the fact that I feel like I was exposed to environment and exposed to negative sort of these consequences that we can still avoid here. Like we haven't got to the point in the prairies where we're doing extensive groundwater irrigation. And so there's an opportunity to pay attention to how much we have, how does it fluctuate with climate variability, and when we start to allocate sort of mass irrigation rights, or even having water rights that are documented and monitored, seeing how those steps should be taken and what the problems were. A lot of the problems, well, not a lot of the problems, but some of the issues that we're having, if you talk about trying to simulate this sort of thing in California, is up until recently, they didn't have to keep track of how much anybody pumped. And so if we go back and you think about the model I just developed, fortunately for us, Kansas has monitored and has kept track of how much water anybody who is pumping for anything other than domestic uses since the early 90s. So we have that data, and it's an unprecedented data set across much of the world. And so if you think about developing that model and not having that data, it becomes impossible to try to figure out what's happening, why it's happening, and how you can change things to better meet your water needs. And so it's things like this that when we shift to Canada, we can sort of say, what lessons have we learned, and how can we move forward through water development and water management to not end up in this same place?
So, Andrea, we've had quite a few questions come in, and I'd like to start passing them your way here. And I'll start off with a question related to the modeling. And the question says, does the US site modeling take into account evaporation from surface waters? And how might that change under different management and climate scenarios that you're thinking of?
Yeah, so it does take into account evaporation. That is a component of the Oasis model for the reservoirs themselves. And then we do it in Hydrogeosphere. We remove it from the reservoir so we don't double count it. In Hydrogeosphere, it's just the surface water bodies. And then we do it on, there's an evapotranspiration module that we use in that code. So it is taken into account, and it's, varies at every time step based on the land cover that you have, the water that you have in the subsurface, how much is available, what part of the growing season that you're in. And what was the rest of the question?
Yeah, just so that how it was sort of integrated into your modeling, and as things change, do you anticipate that evaporation driver is going to significantly change?
Yeah, so of course it's going to change. It's driven by your temperature and a whole host of climate things. So as our climate conditions change, evaporation changes. But there's also some management things that are changing that. So I just finished off a project where the money from the 2016 decision that Kansas got was split between people who just had water rights, regular water rights, and this Kansas Bostwick Irrigation District. And what the irrigation district decided to do was they took some of their laterals, which is their smaller canals. So they have a main stem that will come off of the Republican River. And then off of that, they have smaller canals to sort of reach everybody at their property. And they took the money, and what they're doing is they're actually burying those into pipes. And the whole idea behind that was so they didn't lose that water to evaporation, and also they don't lose that water to infiltration to the groundwater. So that gives them more beneficial use of the water. The study I looked at was saying, okay, that's great, but that means anybody who's using groundwater in this region, you just took away a fairly significant source of water. So let's monitor how the groundwater system is changing because you've taken away this infiltration source. and let's try to figure out what we think the future is going to be like for any groundwater users in the area.
So another question related to this management, and the question is there attention given to the ecosystem protection, for example, wetlands? And is that taken into account in the linear programming? And as a sort of a caveat to that, are First Nations issues taken into account?
So within this basin, there are no First Nations that we're accounting for. There are none within this basin itself. Most of the First Nations, most of the reservations in Kansas are located in sort of the northeast section, a little bit in the central, which is a little bit to the east of our basin that we're looking at. So that wasn't a consideration. Obviously, it was a consideration at one point, but after things had changed, there was nothing there for us to consider. When it comes to the ecosystem protection, the answer is sort of. So Kansas has what they call minimum desirable stream flows. And what this is, if you recall me talking about the water rights, it's called prior appropriation, first in time, first in right. So if I had mine first and you got yours later, I have more right to the water than you do. So if I start not getting my water, you have to shut off until I get mine. And so on April 12th, 1984, they gave an allocation to the river at a couple of gauge stations. And what that means is that if the river dips below a certain level, a certain flow rate, for in some cases there's 5-day accounting, other days there's 7-day accounting, then anybody who has a junior water right to that, so anyone who got a water right after that date, has to shut off. They don't care if your corn's tasseling, how many millions of dollars you've spent. That's what the rules say you need to do. There's ways around it, but you have to reduce your pumping. If you talk to some people, they say this ensures that the stream stays healthy and it's for ecosystem protection. In reality, what it is there are senior water users, water right holders downstream of those gauges, and there's water rights associated with the Milford Reservoir at the downstream end, and that preserves water to meet those as well. So there is sort of an ecosystem allocation, but it's more so for senior water rights, and they get to sort of rewrap it and package it as an ecosystem protection.
Interesting how that evolved. So another interesting question is here, do you think that there are enough extreme events, much like you showed in that flooding, where one could collect the water and store it and use it for human use when you need it? And do we know enough to be able to predict that with climate change?
So there are most of the people who live close enough to the river. There are times where you can just pull water from the river if it's flowing over a certain level and you're not in the irrigation season. And so there's people who have large ponds on their property where they pull that off. They use it, not human use like for us to drink, but they'll use it for pre-wetting their soils or for livestock and whatnot. So there's that there. There was also some research done by a colleague at KGS that I was involved in where we looked at, can we store it underground? Can we do aquifer storage and recovery? And the problem here is that the regulations in Kansas say that if you do that, you have to treat the water to drinking water standards before you inject it into the aquifer. And so while we had great success from that program, particularly using a geoprobe, which is a relatively inexpensive way to drill wells to get water down there, the issue was that you still would have to spend so much money to treat the water to put it in the ground itself. So there are some ways that people are holding on to water within their properties in these ponds, but there isn't really like widespread efforts aside from the reservoir systems.
So one of our attendees tonight also is asking here, given this predicted climate change for the region and continued refusal to reduce and retire agricultural groundwater pumping in Nebraska and Kansas, how long until the irrigation water runs out and the crop-driven economy in these states absolutely crashes?
That's the $1 billion question. So there's estimates the Kansas Geological Survey has estimates across the High Plains Aquifer system, which is a different system from this, where they show the expected livelihood of or rather lifetime of the aquifer. And so if you go down to southwestern Kansas, the corner there's areas that have, if they continue as is, they have less than 10 years of usable aquifer lifetime left. Up where we are, we're not a really deep aquifer system. And so we're very much connected to the climate conditions. We definitely see in the years that I were there and the historic information that I've dealt with, more drought than floods in this region. And so I would say in the Republican River Basin, I don't think we'll ever get to the point where agriculture is completely abolished, but I definitely see, and you can see it when you go and meet with the landowners and meet with the irrigators, that there is attention to adopting as much precision agriculture as they can, changing up their crops to ones that are perhaps more, drought tolerant, require less water. And so there's efforts to make as much use of the little water that they have as possible. And it seems that they're making progress in that way. They can have increased crop yields with less water historically. Some areas also have management strategies that they put in place. So sort of grassroots ones where if there's groups who want to reduce water rights, because the problem here is if you reduce your water use, in their minds, all that means is that there's more for your neighbor to use. So why should you reduce if they're not? So they've put in what they call LEMAs in the state of Kansas, local enhanced management areas. And that's where if there is a certain percentage of people in an area who can agree to reduce their water use by a certain amount, they can now enforce everyone in that area to do so. And they've had some success with these LEMAs. They've also had some lawsuits associated with these LEMAs. But there's a lot of things going on. It's a huge driver of the GDP. It's people's livelihood. It's been in their families for centuries. And so there's a lot of reasons why people want to try to keep this going.
So people are learning and doing their best. It's becoming community driven as well. So that's encouraging to see it.
Yeah, and I will say anybody who thinks that they'll go out to Kansas and have a chat with an irrigator about water and tell them what it's like, these irrigators are very well educated, very well aware of state of the art. They know the best soil moisture sensor, how to put it in. They get information on their iPads. They're the ones who have, self-driving tractors. Their irrigation systems have these low impact precision ag, where the water coming out of each individual hose will modify based on some soil moisture map that they have. They're adopting all of this. They're using all of this, and they know exactly what type of soil they have, the infiltration capacity. And so there's a lot of information, there's a lot of knowledge there, and there's a lot of desire to keep things going.
Yeah, that's so encouraging. So I have a couple of questions here. You're still okay to go? We're a little over time, but there's still...
You can just ignore the noise in the background. My kids are getting ready for bed, and they apparently wrestle before they go to bed.
Wrestling. That's a good thing.
Wrestling and yelling at each other.
No problem. We'll be okay with that. So a question comes in asking how much time is actually needed to develop and run these massive models?
That really depends. They are, when it comes to, so the surface water operations model doesn't take very much time to run. It's a linear optimized model. Like you could essentially set something up on Excel to run like this. The issue is figuring out how to set up and how to program, because it's just its own little coding system, all the rules and regulations. So if you're going to be a stickler for detail and try to get everything in, it's going to take you a while. If you want to make some sort of sweeping assumptions, it may take you less time, but the actual running of that model is seconds. Hydrogeosphere, despite the fact that it looks insanely complex and the physics behind it is, if you properly parameterize it, if you have good data put it in, the calibration process is surprisingly fast because you've included so many of the components that drive that system. a traditional groundwater model, you spend so much time trying to figure out what all of your boundary conditions are because your stream is dictating your infiltration and what is your recharge. But in these systems, because you're like, it rains, rain on my system, here's what it's raining on, here's the topography, here's what's growing. It kind of figures all of that out and generally requires a lot less calibration. The run times, my run times are perhaps a little faster than they should be. If I spent more time hanging out at Aquanti, which is the company that now distributes that code, I'm 100% sure that I can find little tricks to decrease my runtime. But overall, this model, when linked with Oasis, when we simulated, so say from 1996 to 2010, which is our window when those were coupled, those took a couple of days to have everything, but we were simulating changes in precipitation on a daily basis. We have pumps shutting on and off, and these are not low capacity pumps. So the minute you have a change to the system, that's where everything slows down, where it all of a sudden has to slow down and say, okay, now you're pumping thousands of gallons of water out per minute. I have to slowly see how this groundwater is going to change because it won't just let it drop quickly. It needs to capture that temporal variability.
So, and I'll let you guess who asked this question. Starting off with wonderful lecture, Andrea. And the question says, we've become very accustomed to weather forecasting, but what are your thoughts on the appetite for water managers and other users of these 3D hydrologic surface water, groundwater models to use forecasting driven by short and long-term weather forecasts, another almost real-time integration of weather forecasting?
Yeah, so I think that's the future of this, right? As we get increased capacity for computational, so I just talked about runtimes, and all of that is running on a desktop in my office at KGS. That's not utilizing supercomputers or major cloud computing where you can dissipate and use, it wasn't even using a parallel version of the code. And so you can do a lot of things to reduce those runtimes and to make it so that you don't have to download all of this data. You can automate going to get those weather forecasts, to get those predictions, pulling it into the model, having that model run and giving you an output that you can then act upon. There's many places across the US and the world that have some real-time water management forecasting. Most of them are not perhaps as detailed as you would get out of, say, the model that I showed here. But that is, I think, certainly the way of the future, is being able to say, okay, based on, because everything is so dictated by what's happening in the climate, based on what's projected to happen, what do we expect to happen in the basin? And like I said at the beginning of the talk, being able to be flexible and saying, okay, so now what's going to happen? Okay, what can we do to make sure we don't flood? What can we do to make sure we have enough water to meet the demands that we know are coming in, and have a system that can respond to that? That's where I see things going, and I'm pretty excited about it.
So there's another question that leads on from that, and that is, what do you think is the ideal scale for this type of multidimensional research? Should it be based on chronic shortages, predicted demand, or based on the physical environment, or what do you think? What's your recommendation for the best use of these types of tools?
Depends. So it depends on where you are and what's important, right? So in this basin, the most important thing here is on a seasonal basis, and it is based on water demand, because that's what drives the economics, and that's what is, first and foremost in people's minds. There's other areas in Kansas where they're developing models, and the primary concern is the long-term health of a fairly large salt marsh region. And so there, when you're building models and you're building the scope and sort of what you're trying to look at, what you're interested in is in long-term. So now you can build a model that maybe has a little less attention to the fine scale details on the temporal resolution, but pays attention to what's happening in sort of that longer scale. So with any model, I firmly believe you can't really develop a model to solve every problem and all the problems all at once, although I suspect there's people on this call who will disagree with me on that. But I think you need to know what is the main goal of your model, and make sure you build it to answer that. And that's really your most efficient way forward, is knowing what your problem is in the first place.
So that makes a lot of sense. And we've got a couple of other ones, if you're still okay.
Yep.
So one question comes in asking about environmental in-stream needs, and you talked about that a bit. And this is, for instance, ensuring that the spawning areas have adequate amount of water at the right times. I guess it comes back to the ecological question. And do you think, would that have been accounted for in the model, specifically something like that?
Yeah, so that wasn't, the surface water operations model was built so that meeting this minimum desirable stream flow, which is really the only actual thing, tangible rule or regulation that can even be construed as trying to address the ecological need. So we did apply the priority to that, right? You did want to meet that MDS, and we actually gave it a higher priority than it normally would under sort of the way that the water rights occurred, because if that one doesn't get met, all of the ones below it fall down, and there's major economic repercussions to that. And so that was given a fairly high priority. And so it was taken into account, but again, it had zero, like the flows that we're aiming for and the timing of it has zero to do with the ecological need and everything to do with who needs the water downstream. So we can kind of say it was an ecological thing, but it wasn't designed for that purpose.
So one question comes in regarding the installation of the artificial canals, and wondering how that would increase or decrease contaminant loading, sediment transport, and even recharge to the aquifer systems. How significant is that, in your opinion?
So for recharge, we know that the areas where where they just converted from these canals to buried pipes, and these are the laterals, which are small, and by small I mean the pipes they replaced them with were still like 3 feet in diameter, so they're still a decent size canal system. And when they removed those, we saw over the course of 3 years in one area, the groundwater level dropped up to 3 meters, where they were. It obviously varied based on how close or far they were from the canals. So we do know that they're a fairly significant recharge source, at least locally, to the system. With respect to nutrient distribution and sediment, what it does is it distributes sediment to an area that normally wouldn't have it because you built this canal. And most of the canals aren't that nice cement lined one that I showed. Most of them are just like they literally took the backhoe and dug it out. In some places in the main stem, they try to put riprap down, or actually in one part of Nebraska, they have old squished cars to try to stabilize the side of the river, or the canal rather. And so you have distribution of sediment where you normally wouldn't, but you also have this sort of fast tracking. So a lot of our nutrient transport, or a lot of our nutrient load comes from sort of surface runoff or shallow subsurface runoff from these fields. And if you think about how long it would take those nutrient loads to get to the Republican River if the canal wasn't there, it would have probably flow over the water, infiltrate into the groundwater system, and make its way there. Now we've dug a canal where when we have big rain events, it flows down, the nutrients move, it hits the canal, and it fast tracks it into this river. And so you're basically increasing the area that can contribute to these short-term nutrient loading to the stream by putting in these canals.
So they have a pretty complex role to play, and hard to anticipate in advance how difficult that can be.
Well, especially when you think about the planning of it, because they pre-wet the canals for a very set period, and you know that water can only flow between June 1st and October 1st, but you have no idea how much is going to go through those canals because it's dictated by the people who are part of the irrigation district to request the water. And so it's not like the flow through these canals is dictated by precipitation or anything. In fact, it's completely counter to precipitation. When you have a lot of rain, you don't have a lot of flow through the canals. When it's dry, you do have a lot of flow through the canals. So it's really hard to try to wrap your head around how we think a natural stream should occur. And this one kind of tilts that on its head and is completely different.
Yeah, so hard to anticipate before you start working with it. So we have one more question, then and this you may or may not have know this one, but it's a question we often get, and that is, in terms of the Great Lakes system, you know, how do you see in the future water rights and management of the Great Lakes system playing out between Canada and the United States? Talk about transboundary. Is that something you might focus your attention on in the future?
Yeah, like I'm not in this research field because it's easy. I like the complex stuff, and I really like when we're bringing together not just the physical science and the physics of the system, but now bringing in policy and people's values and social norms and all of these decision-making things. And so when it comes to, you know, the agreements between the US and Canada, you know, I think both countries are acutely aware of how important water is and wanting to sort of, you know, preserve all the resources that we can. But at the same time too, in order to have that agreement to work, we have to make sure that, you know, the revolving doors of politicians that come through in both countries, they're getting along, and that it isn't something that's being used as, say, a bargaining tool or some sort of manipulation. I have a lot of hope. There's a lot of, you know, agencies and joint commissions and whatnot associated with the Great Lakes to really try to, you know, do the best to manage them between the two countries. But I'm just starting to dip my feet back into all of the water issues across Canada and the Great Lakes. And this pandemic has not helped, because I can't just go to conferences and chat with people or stroll down a hallway and bump into somebody. I have to like track them down and force them into a Zoom meeting, which as an extrovert, it's kind of killing me that I can't see people more often. But yeah, so I'd like to sort of get more involved in that, and I have proposals that I'm writing to try to get into that, but not yet.
Yeah, well, you know, I think we'll end our questions there. We're over time here, but thank you so much for staying and taking all the questions that everybody asked, and for your super insightful questions. We're really fortunate to have you back here. The problems are not going to get any easier. And having that type of breadth of understanding of these problems is what we're really going to need. So, Megan, anything else we need to add before we sign off for the evening?
I'm just, you know, now I'm trying to hit all the right buttons.
Yeah, I had some wrong buttons too.
Right. Well, that's just what everybody wants. No, this was awesome. So we will start the series again in the fall. But otherwise, thank you very much to both of you for spending your evening with us. It was great.
And thanks everyone for joining us. Again, wish we could all be here together and head off down the hall for a beer, but we will do that soon. And we're really looking forward to it. So thanks again for joining us, and we'll keep your eyes open for the next one that's coming along. It's a great series for us. So thank you again, Andrea, and we'll chat again soon.
And thank you everybody for joining. Have a wonderful evening.
So long, everyone.